Hola Daniel, hola Daniel, ¿me escuchas? Está sin audio.
¿Aló?
Ahora sí.
No te reconozco la voz.
Hola.
Ajá. Mire, qué tonta.
Bien, ¿y tú?
Pensé que era la chica o la Nicole, y decía, ¿cómo no reconozco? Eres tú.
No, soy yo. Estoy apoyando a la chica.
Ya,
Estoy
estoy en
esperando
el link
que...
correcto, ¿no es cierto? Pensé que iba a llegar tercero y llegué primero, parece.
No, llegaste primero. Estoy
Ya.
esperando que se conecte Bruce y Nate y Naim Bro para pasarlos
Sí,
como
creo que de los
panelistas.
autores va a haber uno solo, ¿ah? Eso es lo que salía en los mails. El
Ya,
Nathan Sanders
perfecto.
creo que va a ser el único que se va a conectar, el otro no podía.
Perfecto. Yo después inicio la grabación, así que no debería haber ningún problema.
Ya. Sí. Pero está grabándose ahora, dice.
Ah, ya voy a
Claudio
parar.
Corina.
So, it's ready.
Okay, so the audience is online, right? They're seeing us and hearing us. Okay, so buenas tardes a todos. Good afternoon, everyone. Vamos a hablar en inglés la charla va a ser en inglés, so vamos a hacer la charla en inglés. Yo también voy a hablar en inglés para que todos hablemos el mismo idioma. So I turn to English now. Good afternoon, everyone. Um, for those following the World Cup, this is the warm up for the game in 1 hour, where we have France playing Norway, a good one of the good matches in this group stage of the World Cup. Nathan Sanders here in your screen is actually not far from that game. Because the game is being played near Boston, and now I pass to introduce Nathan. It's a very big pleasure to have you, Nathan. He's a data scientist affiliated with Harvard's Berkham Klein Center and co-author with Bruce Schneier. I'm not sure if that's the correct pronunciation of Rewiring Democracy. Here, the book, How AI Will Transform Our Politics, Government, and Citizenship. So Nathan's work sits right at the intersection of AI, public policy, and democracy participation, asking not only what AI will do to politics, but what democratic societies should do with AI. So please join me in welcoming Nathan Sanders. It's, again, a very big pleasure. And we also have Daniel Brieva. He is an associate professor at our School of Government here at UAI, Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez, and he will be commenting on Nathan's presentation and on his book. So, without further ado, I give the word to Nathan.
Well, thank
Just so
you
we
so
have our
much.
clear, sorry, just so we're clear in the timelines, how much time does Nathan have and how much do I have so we know?
Yeah, I think we usually you do 30 to 40 minutes the
Yeah,
presentation, then 10 minutes for comments. Then we have a short window for questions from the audience. But this is flexible, so we can rearrange it.
great.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sounds great. I'll make sure I wrap up by 2:45 at the latest then. Thank you so much for the introduction, Naeem and Daniel. It's great to be in dialogue with everybody here. I'm so delighted to join you in the conversation and hope to learn a lot from you, and I'm eager to get into the discussion. But I will share just some slides and a brief overview of some of the ideas that we explore in our book. I'll go ahead and share my screen. I do apologize as well to force our conversation to be in English. I'm sorry that I don't have more language skills to be able to engage directly in Spanish today. So I will talk about our book, Rewiring Democracy. Thank you, Naeem, so much for already highlighting it. Do want to credit again my fantastic colleague and co-author, Bruce Schneier at the Harvard Kennedy School, We often present this work together, but unfortunately, you just have me today because Bruce had a schedule conflict. There are, I think, two big questions that ultimately we pose in the book and that I want to focus on in the talk today. One is, what can we observe about what effects AI is starting to have on democracies around the world? And when we started writing this book, really 2022, 2023, those effects were very nascent. But since then, in just a few years, we've all seen, I think, a great acceleration of those impacts of AI and often different impacts in different places. And so we've tried to take a very international point of view to learn from those impacts and ultimately to ask the second question, what can we all do collectively to steer those impacts and to help the industry of AI and the uses of AI and our own democracies co-develop in such a way that leads to a strengthening of democracy? We're very aware, we talk a lot about in our book, we will talk a lot today, I'm sure, about the risks, the challenges, the problems AI is creating for society and in democracy. And we recognize those. And for us, the challenge is how can we make that better? How can we make that situation better? How can we get to better outcomes for democracy? So in our book, we have scores, maybe, probably more than 100 examples, short case studies that we look at of applications of AI in countries around the world. And we try to go beyond those nascent examples to speculate about what they will lead to, what will come next. The book isn't meant to be just a current day survey. It's also not meant to be about what happens 100 years from now. A lot of people are thinking about kind of far future long-term impacts of AI. We're looking a little bit more at the medium term. What can we demonstrably anticipate as nearer or medium-term outcomes of what AI is starting to do and impacting democracy today? We're confident that the capabilities of the technology will continue to advance. We think we can chart a trajectory forward from what the initial impacts of AI are today to what the impacts of those capabilities may be in the future. And our hope is that by imagining those multiple possible outcomes, we can choose together which ones we want, and we can steer towards those better outcomes. So that's really the spirit of the book. And we have a few frameworks that we introduce in the book. I'll just introduce a couple of them today. I'll start with how we think about the areas where AI is impactful. I think we can all look around the world at what the private sector is doing and what public sector applications of AI look like. And we can all probably think of some examples where AI is probably being used in a place where it doesn't necessarily make a difference, or we don't necessarily want it to be used because we don't think it's helpful there. But I think there's a structured way to think about where AI can make a difference, where it does matter, where it might have a good or a bad impact. And those are in the four areas that AI demonstrably has different, I think, legitimately superior capabilities to humans. And I think these are probably not controversial to say. The first is that AI can be much faster than people. It doesn't necessarily do things better than humans do, but in many cases, it can do something that's comparable or maybe worse than a human can do, but it can definitely do it faster. I think we can see many examples of that. One that we cite in the book is the idea of super resolution imaging, the idea that a human artist or a scientist who's working on something like jet propulsion can look at simulation data or look at image data and fill in details where there are gaps in the data. And AI is not necessarily better at that, but it can do it much faster. Another is scale. AI can do maybe the same thing a person might do, but it can be in many places at once, whereas an individual human, of course, cannot. There's so many applications in government where that's very important, where we don't have often the finances, or at least we haven't made a democratic choice to spend the money to hire enough people to serve a function in administration in as many places as we'd like. In the US, in particular, we have many examples of that in our judiciary system, where we haven't invested enough to make immigration proceedings or drug court proceedings fast. We just don't have enough people we're employing in the system. And so those whole systems ground to a halt. AI is not necessarily appropriate or better in those circumstances, but it can definitely scale more than humans can. Third is scope. As individual humans, we all develop areas of expertise, and some people are remarkable in having multiple areas of expertise. But of course, no one person can be expert on everything. AI systems, likewise, are not perfect, have lots of gaps in knowledge, but they're different than humans in that they can have uniform training across a wide variety of different fields, more generalization in their scope. And then lastly, sophistication. And I want to emphasize yet again, by more sophisticated, I don't mean that AI is better or superior in performance to people, but I do mean that it can take more factors into account in decision making than a person reasonably could. particularly we've seen as the context window of foundation models has grown and grown to be millions of tokens, meaning AIs are capable of taking, think of it as entire bookshelves worth of information into memory, take all of that information into consideration at the same time. That's just a different capability than humans have. So we think of this as a framework, speed, scale, scope, and sophistication, for identifying where AI is potentially impactful and also where it is not. So in our book, we do have lots and lots of examples that we learned from internationally around the world. I want to introduce just a few of those today. I'm going to spend just a few minutes on a few different case studies. And I want to call out that we are publishing some more elaborated versions of these case studies right now. And our colleague, Danielle Allen, who's faculty at Harvard, she has a publication called The Renovator. And we're publishing a series there called Rewiring Democracy Now, which is taking some of the stories from our book and checking in on what's happened since the book was published and interviewing the protagonists, the people involved in that work, and providing some longer form journalism on those case studies. And I'll share just a few examples of those with you. So I figured I would start with a case study from South America, from Brazil, an organization that many of you may, I hope, have encountered or be familiar with, Open Knowledge Brazil, and some of the work that they're doing leveraging ML and AI and government oversight. So this may be a story that's familiar to you all, but it's one that, from my vantage point, starts in 2016, when a group of civic technologists, including Ariel Muskoff and others listed here, got together to try and work on a project that would uncover public corruption among Brazilian officials. And they called this project Operation Love Serenade, named after the chocolate, with the goal of uncovering types of corruption inspired by the famous Toblerone incident in Northern Europe, where public officials were found to have been buying luxury chocolates like Toblerone bars with public funds in opposition, in violation of public expense laws. So these civic technologists in 2016 built, using machine learning, a system to take thousands and thousands of public expense reports and to automatically identify outliers, to identify potential fraudulent uses of public funds. And when they found them, to automatically issue a tweet from a bot called Rosie to expose to the world that potential case of fraud. And ultimately, since 2016, Rosie reported hundreds of machine learning classified cases of potential improper spending. So I'm going to borrow some slides that Ariel has used and published just to show some examples. They found public officials who were reporting expensing 13 meals in a single day. That seems unlikely. People who said that they had 3 lunches that the public should pay for, apparently on 3 different continents at the same time. And even a public official who apparently was buying a goat with public funding in a way that didn't seem obviously tied to their job. So these are just some very visible examples of how machine learning was used at that time to provide a government oversight functionality that has become a really meaningful story for folks like myself who are doing work in civic technology around the world and looking to leverage data science and machine learning and AI as a useful civic technology. So at least in the US, a lot of folks know about the story of Operation Love Serenade, but I think what's less well known is what's happened since then, since 2016, where this story came to international awareness. And so we followed up with Heidi Svab, who is the current leader of Open Knowledge Brazil, the nonprofit organization that became a steward of this project, Operation Love Serenade. And Open Knowledge Brazil has a lot of other projects, some of whom have been directly contributed to by the founders of Operation Love Serenade or inspired by that work. And so when we spoke with Haiti a few months ago, we learned about those projects like, and please forgive my pronunciation, I know I'm going to get this wrong and I do apologize, but Quirdo Diario, which is a project that they've established to scrape information from municipal government websites across Brazil, currently operating across more than 500 local government websites, downloading diaries of civic transactions, of government transactions at the local level. And Haiti shared with us some of the really significant impacts that that work has had, including use by journalists at places like The Intercept in Brazil to look through that data to identify instances of apparent fraud, for example, in flood control in Brazil. And so they continue to have a meaningful work through this kind of open civic technology. But Haiti also shared with us a truth that I know is unfortunately widespread, which is that in 2026, it is not an easy time to be a nonprofit group doing civic technology work. And that is unfortunately, I think, especially true in the global South. Haiti shared with us that although Open Knowledge Brazil does not directly receive funding from USAID, the agency of the US government that has been a distributor of so much foreign aid, which the current Trump administration has effectively shut down, even though they were not a recipient of USAID funding, they have been impacted like the whole nonprofit sector in Brazil and around so much of the global South by the hit on the philanthropic ecosystem that losing USAID has caused. And as well, they see a retrenchment in liberal democracy that makes it harder to do this kind of government oversight work in general. That puts those who may be journalists or civic technologists doing this kind of work at risk of reprisal from the government. And as a result of this, ultimately, Open Knowledge Brazil has had a significant loss of resources. It's had its staff cut in half, and those who are remaining on the team often have fewer hours, fewer resources to do the work. So this is obviously a disappointing picture for those of us who are really invested in good government and in civic technology. But Haiti also shared with us some of the reasons that she is optimistic and sees ways to persist through that difficult challenge. And AI is part of that story. Part of what they're doing at Open Knowledge Brazil is finding ways to do more with less, leveraging agentic engineering capabilities of AI to help them do more of that civic technology software development work with fewer people, and to leverage better networks of volunteers to help contribute and to ultimately make progress perhaps even faster than they could before, even with fewer staff. So this is obviously a challenging picture. I think we would all prefer more investment in this area rather than less. But to me, it is inspiring to see people looking to do good work in good governance make use of new technologies to help sustain that work. So I think the question that's raised by this is what civic technology innovations, not just in the US, but globally, will emerge as civic technologists or hacktivists or people looking to do good get access to more and more tools and capabilities that AI offers in the coming years. So with that, I'll transition to another case study from a little farther away in Asia. This is a case study from Japan about a party with a new vision for digital democracy. So I needed a little bit of a primer on Japanese politics. Perhaps it's useful to you as well, so I'll share it. Japan has a multi-party system, and in their national legislature, the Diet, they have had a single party which has been first among those parties. It has been dominant in terms of representation for decades, and that's the LDP. So this is just a chart of representation by number of seats over time in the Japanese legislature and the Diet, and you can see the representation of different parties. And with the exception of one very short period in the 2000s, the LDP has maintained a totally dominant position. So in that landscape, Takahiro Ono ran for office for the first time. This is Ono-san. When he first ran, was a 33-year-old software engineer and AI developer running for office for the first time. He was running to become governor of Tokyo, the province, and he had no political background. He was not affiliated with a party. He had no funding. He had no volunteer organization. He was really starting from scratch. And he knew that to be successful, he needed a different way to engage voters. He couldn't do it all himself in the traditional way. And so he applied his skills as an AI developer to figure out ways he could use technology to help him scalably engage with voters. So for example, the screenshot on the bottom is one of the things that he did. He developed a simplistic avatar of himself that live streamed on YouTube for weeks at a time in order to sit alongside him as he was going out as a person in the real world, shaking hands, meeting people, doing politics. At the same time, his avatar was live streaming on YouTube, taking questions from voters and responding to them with answers based on his policy platform. So ultimately, this live streamed avatar responded to more than 8,000 questions from voters over several weeks. And Takahiro Ono ultimately did not win this race, but he did win 150,000 votes as someone that no one had ever heard of before this campaign. And that was good enough to become fifth out of 56 candidates in the governor's race. So that was, I think, in many ways an impressive showing, but obviously did not result in building political power directly. And so Ono's response to this was to form a new political party, which is called Team Mirai. When we wrote about Ono in the book, he had just run this campaign and he had not yet founded this party. So we connected with him several times over the last few months to learn about what he's done since we wrote the book, and there's a lot to share. In 2025, he ran again for another seat, and he ultimately won. He is now effectively a senator. He's a member of the upper chamber of the Diet in Japan. And now, for the first time, his new political party, called Team Mirai, which means Future Party, has a seat. It has representation in the national legislature. And he has now recruited candidates nationwide and built a real political party. Part of the resources that he's using to do that is the public funding that's offered to Japanese political parties. This is very unlike in the US, and I'm not sure how common it is in other places, but in Japan, political parties are allocated public funds as a fraction of their representation in the Diet. So with his one seat in the upper chamber, his party received about $1 million USD, roughly, in public funding. And he spent that in a way that is very non-traditional. He didn't spend it just on hiring staff for his office or on the traditional tools of campaigning, but instead he used it to employ civic technologists to hire AI engineers to help build applications like he had done for his own campaign. So I'll just give you a quick flavor of what some of those applications look like. This is a tool called Idobata. It's an AI interviewer. And the way Ano-san conceives of it is to enable scalable digital consultation or deep listening. The idea that he wants to be able to hear from as many voters as possible, and not just to get their response to a survey where they might check a box, but to really interrogate their perspective on an issue. So the way it works is that a voter can log into this AI tool. They can have a conversation about an issue that is facilitated by an AI, and ultimately asks and dives deeper with the voter about their stance on that policy and asks them for feedback. And the outcome of that discussion is direct feedback to the political party. It's offered as a literal pull request. So this is the way that open source software developers exchange code or ideas with each other. A pull request against Team Urai's own policy platform, which is stored on GitHub, popular platform for doing open source software development. So ultimately, before this year's election in 2026, they collected about 6,000 policy proposals from voters who had logged into this AI system and ultimately generated feedback for the party through it. And one of the reasons I think this is interesting is not just that it's a scalable way to get input from people, but it also gives people a signal back from the party. It helps them see the impact that they're having. They can see the conversation that they had, whether it's with a campaign official or person or with an AI interviewer. They uniquely get to see the outcome of that conversation as a recommendation to the party, and they get to see if the party adopts it or not. So in the screenshot on the bottom, you can see an instance where Ano-san himself had accepted the suggestion from a voter, had said, yes, we're going to adopt your recommendation into our party's policy platform, and we're going to run on that across Japan. And you can see in this machine translated from the Japanese post how appreciative the voter was of that. I think this is a really interesting new way to do politics that's just so different, at least from the way it works in the US today, where there's so little ability to really have that deep listening and to hear from voters directly for a candidate or for a party, that makes it quite interesting. Another example of one of the applications that they've built is called the Action Board, and it's sort of a way of gamifying and creating a small incentive structure for people to volunteer with the campaign, to not just give feedback through an online application, but to go out in the world and do politics. So they have contests or leaderboards on Action Board for topics like putting up posters in your district, going out and helping advertise for the party. And people compete with each other to see who can do the most. And this has been an effective system for getting people involved. They've had more than 20,000 users register, more than 250,000 people take actions recorded in the system in the 2025 campaign when they first used it, and overall more than 1 million of those actions recorded. So this is a brand new party that didn't even exist when we wrote our book, but has suddenly become one of the 5 or 6 largest political parties in Japan by representation. They now have 11 seats in addition to Ano-san's own seat in the upper chamber by virtue of the seats they won in the lower chamber elections that happened just a few months ago in Japan. So clearly they are not positioned to compete with the LDP, which remains and has strengthened its position as the dominant party, but they have built a meaningful political base in Japan's multi-party system. And that means also that they now have more public funding. So they've gone from about 1 million to about 5 million US dollars annually in public funding. And they're continuing to use it to develop this kind of open source civic technology. And I emphasize open source here because Ano-san describes the goal of the party as to be a utility party, meaning that their function is to create tools and infrastructure that all the Japanese political parties and the democracy at large can leverage to hopefully make democracy function better. So for example, the LDP has started to use some of the applications that Team Urai has developed for their own voter engagement and transparency initiatives. And like Open Knowledge Brazil, they're aggressively leveraging AI tools in that development process. So I'll just briefly share a couple of the applications that they've developed just this year as they've leveraged this additional funding. They've developed a legislative engagement application called GCAI, which provides information about bills in the Diet to voters. You can go to this application online and you can see summaries of all the bills in the Diet, descriptions of the legislative impact of the bill generated with AI, links to news reporting from Japanese journalists, an AI chat feature that helps you ask questions and get answers about the bill. And at least when this first launched at the end of 2025, it seemed to be getting some uptake. There were at least a couple 100,000 views per day at that time. And then one last application I'll show is a financial transparency application called Merumi. This automatically reports all the expense records, both the expense and the revenue records of the party itself, of Team Mirai. I believe this is actually the application that the LDP, the dominant party, has also now adopted to make their own financial transactions transparent too. I think this is interesting because this is very much like the civic technology that the Operation Love Serenade team developed in Brazil a decade ago. But now it's not only being developed as an open source project in the Brazilian case by technologists outside of government, but now we have a political party that's really founded on the idea of bringing these types of civic technology applications, digital tools for good governance into Japanese democracy from the inside, from the public sector. So when we spoke with Ano, he gave us a sense of how he considers his party positioned within the Japanese multi-party system. Like so many other places around the world, there is a left-right ideological spectrum in Japanese politics. But as he describes it, there's also another spectrum where many parties have not really exploited new positioning, which is this y-axis orientation between the status quo or the future. Team Mirai is meant to be the future party, and the positioning that Ano described to us is that they do not intend to be highly ideologically aligned on the left or right. Instead, they're a centrist party that's focused on driving Japanese democracy into the future and working with other parties to do that. So I'll just editorialize here to say that I think for myself, and I'm sure for many of you, the positioning of this party isn't necessarily where I would vote. It's not necessarily reflective of my own politics. However, I do think it's inspiring to see political parties really trying to reinvent how politics should work and how government should function using new technologies and trying to do so in an open, transparent, and pro-social way. So for me, I think the question that this case study raises is when will a digital democracy party like this emerge elsewhere, and what will that look like, and how will it be different in different places? Okay, I'll spend just a few minutes on two more case studies. Next, moving to Europe, a case study from Scotland about the use of government investment in deliberative technologies. So some context here about the Scottish situation. Scotland has particular headwinds that its legislature faces to build trust with voters, with constituents. One of the headwinds is that their parliament is new. It was only a little bit more than 2 decades ago that the UK devolved certain powers from the UK government to the Scottish government. So their parliament was newly created only about a quarter of a century ago, and it has limited powers. There are many things that voters may want that the Scottish Parliament is not responsible for. It does not have direct control or sovereignty over. And in addition to that, Scotland is facing really complicated political dynamics in the UK, including anti-monarchist movements that resist authority stemming from UK and from London, independence movements. Of course, we have Brexit as well, ties to the European Union. Many roiling political factors that have engendered distrust in institutions in Scotland. And so the Scottish Parliament has sought out ways to make that situation better and to improve their trust with constituents. And part of the way that they've done that is by investing in civic technology. Since 2016, for a decade, the Scottish government has sponsored a program called CivTech, which is a set of challenges in civic technology where they award funding to organizations that will build technology to help the Scottish government function better in various ways. Their challenge 10.7, CivTech 10.7, was launched a few months ago with a focus on developing participatory technologies that help people participate in policymaking with the Scottish Parliament. And so they made £650,000 available to the winner of this challenge to help develop participatory technology software. And the idea is that they're not just giving a grant out just for the benefit of the grantee, but also they're using this as a way to provision software development that the Scottish government retains a perpetual license to use. So it's sort of a dual use challenge that creates something that's good that a company or an academic group may continue to use with many governments or other organizations, but also Scotland has a special stake in it. So the winner of the CivTech 10.7 challenge is a new startup in Scotland called CrownShy, which was founded by Stuart Lynn, who we've spoken to many times over the last few months, and his colleague Liz Berry, who is someone we've spoken to many times as well. And they've been developing a platform called Corella, which is shown on the bottom. This is their response to the CivTech 10.7 challenge. And Corella is a platform that's dedicated to providing a way for governments to engage in participatory policymaking, deliberative processes with voters, with constituents in online and offline formats. And it's being developed in a way that's open source and meant to be interoperable with other types of tools that already exist in the space and for other governments to use. So we logged into the Corella platform a couple of weeks ago when we got access from Stuart, and we were able to grab some screenshots just to share with you what this looks like. For example, they've held a deliberation about the future of the space sector, the aerospace industry for Scotland. So this is what it looks like when you log on to participate in the platform. You're introduced to the issue, and they have a page that gives you an overview of the problem, the Scottish space sector and its challenges. And that includes, on the left, as you can see, written description and some videos, sort of traditional ways of giving people that information, but also a learning assistant feature, a chatbot that allows the user to ask questions and get more detailed or contextualized information. And all the responses from that chatbot are grounded directly in the materials that the government has put together to facilitate this deliberation. So it's information that's not made up by the chatbot, but drawing from those materials. The user goes through several steps to ultimately provide their perspective, and one of those is rating perspectives from other participants. So if you've used tools like Polis or other forms of facilitating deliberative collaborations, you may have seen functionality like this. It's very much tied with those pre-existing examples. So what it looks like is sharing with the user some perspectives that others who have taken part of the conversation have previously shared. For example, a user said that Scotland should try to become a global leader in the space industry. That's their perspective on this issue. And the user who's participating is invited to agree or disagree, and thereby the system gets more information about public opinion about the issue. But this platform goes beyond just getting sort of that survey response, yay, nay, to a given perspective. It also elicits perspectives from the user. So this looks a little bit like that AI interviewer application from Team Mirai that we looked at a moment ago. It's a chatbot that asks questions and interrogates the user's perspective about the policy issue, and ultimately captures from them claims, ideas that may reflect this user's point of view, and it asks them to approve or disapprove of them. Is this really what you meant? Is this what you want others to think about your perspective on the issue? And then those go back into the queue for others to agree with or disagree with. And the last piece of this platform I think is really interesting. It's a way of bringing the human, the identity, the person into the conversation and not just the things that they said. At the end of the participation, they invite people to optionally share their own story, to pull out their phone, record a video, direct a camera of them sharing why they care about that issue or what they think about it. And then you have an opportunity to see what other people said in that way. So CrownShy is building Corella as a participatory digital democracy platform that they want to be used by others around the world. It's being developed directly in response to the needs of the Scottish Parliament, but it's being built in a way that's interoperable with other civic technologies and meant to be available to others, particularly because they're situated in the EU, where there are relatively strong, at least compared to the US, data privacy laws, GDPR. UK, Scotland obviously is no longer in the EU in the way it was a few years ago, but they also have many clients who are directly in the EU that they're thinking about. And so anyway, they've thought about how to decentralize data ownership so that someone who participates in that conversation has their voice heard and included, but also retains some control over what they said and their own data. So I think the question posed by the CrownShy team is, how can governments directly engage to build technology that enables more trusting relationships with constituents? Is that possible? Is technology an effective basis for building that kind of improved trust in a scalable way? All right, I've got one more case study to share with you, which is another one from Europe, from Switzerland, about a group that's developing a public alternative to corporate AI. I actually just came from Cambridge, from the Harvard campus, and I was sitting with one of the leaders of this project that I'll speak about in a moment. I got to hear his sort of current overview of the status, and it was exciting to hear about the progress that they're making. The context for this is really what I see, what we write about in our book, as the biggest challenge that we think AI is creating for democracy today, which is the concentration of power and wealth in the biggest technology corporations in the world, which are choosing to consume resources rapaciously for the development of AI. So here are the numbers of what that looks like. This year alone, we have 5 or 6 big tech companies spending $3 quarters of a trillion dollars in capital resources building physical infrastructure for AI, data centers in particular. We have a single company, NVIDIA, which now actually has a market capitalization of more than $5 trillion. This is a company that most people had never heard of a couple years ago, and suddenly is perhaps the wealthiest company in the history of the world on the basis of investment interest in AI. And meanwhile, AI's share of global energy consumption is growing unsustainably. It is relatively small today, less than 1% of global energy use, but it's growing at a severe and accelerating rate to the point where we should be very concerned about its sustainability. And what I would emphasize is that I don't believe that these are natural consequences of the technology. I don't believe there's anything about AI that means that it has to be invested in a unsustainable way, that we have to spend trillions of dollars developing data centers, that we have to use it to an extent that it consumes global energy usage in an unsustainable way. These are problems of the capitalist system that we're developing the technology under, not the technology itself. So this group in Switzerland is envisioning a different way, a fundamentally alternative way to develop AI models that's very different from that US-led big tech approach. And this is now a movement internationally called public AI. The idea of public AI is to have public institutions train models as an alternative to big tech trained models. In Switzerland, there's a coalition of Swiss universities in the ETH system that are developing a model called Apertus. And this is a model that is being purpose-built for civic use cases in Europe. It's being trained across 1,000 European languages. It's being trained at scale of more than 15 trillion tokens in training, but it's being built in a way that's fundamentally different than most of the US-based big tech models, in that it's focusing on regulatory compliance and ethics instead of training on data that is arguably stolen from publishers and content creators. It's being trained on data that is verified to be licensed for their use. It's trained with public computing resources, pre-existing Swiss National Supercomputing Center, the CSCS, that is powered by renewable energy, by hydropower, rather than by building massive new data centers for AI development. And it's being trained at a scale that is less than the biggest of the corporate models. It's an 80 billion parameter model right now. That's probably an order of magnitude, more than an order of magnitude smaller than the biggest models from OpenAI and Anthropic. And from my point of view, that's a feature in many ways as opposed to a bug, in the sense that it doesn't cost hundreds of millions of dollars of capital or energy resources to train, but it's being developed intentionally at a smaller scale that is usable without necessarily chasing small increments of improvement on leaderboards of technology performance. And it's also being made open source. It's being made a public good for others to use. So ultimately, the idea of public AI is to develop this technology under fundamentally different incentives than the capitalist ones that are undergirding the development of AI in American big tech companies, with the idea of capturing value for public use and by public use rather than for corporate exploitation. So we've spoken to a couple of the leaders of this project, including Emmanuel Schlag, who's one of the technical leaders of the development team, the Apertus team. I know that they have a new version of Apertus that's coming out in just a few months, which will feature new multimodal capabilities and will work better in agentic use cases. And they're ultimately developing a 2.0 version of the model as well that'll be trained at a somewhat larger scale. So we write in our piece on the Renovator a little bit about what's coming next. But just this morning, I was also sitting with Josh Tant, who's now a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, where I'm based as well. And he's developed a really interesting institution called publicai.co, which is the Public AI Inference Utility. This is a nonprofit that provides a commercial service, a software service for people to use the Apertus model. So they're providing it in a way that makes it a legitimate alternative to choosing to use a model from OpenAI or Anthropic or another company that's available for people to use at a nominal cost. The way he's doing this is by aggregating public computing infrastructure across companies like Switzerland, Austria, Germany, and Singapore, and making that available for people to run public AI models like Apertus and to ultimately provide an alternative to big tech companies that has superior ethics, sustainability, and compliance. So what I'm very eager to follow next is if this fundamentally different model for developing AI has advantages, will it actually have uptake? Will users demand models that are more compliant, that are more ethically developed? Will they demand alternatives to the way big tech operates today? So I promised I would end at 2:45. So I'm just going to very briefly share one more framework, which is how we think about steering AI's influence on democracy based on these case studies. And we ultimately recommend four things: reforming, resisting, responsibly using AI, and renovating democracy. So just briefly, let me unpack each of these. By reforming AI, we mean projects that provide fundamentally different and hopefully better ways of developing the technology, reforming the ecosystem of AI development. We see public AI as a really foundational approach to doing that. And so we've been tracking projects like Apertus, which are showing real world versions of how that can work. By resisting AI, we mean organizing citizens, organizing voters to resist applications of AI in governance and in society that we don't agree with, that are inappropriate, that are unethical. A very visible example of this in the US happened a few weeks ago when Anthropic stood up and resisted the use of their technology in defense and surveillance use cases. And let me be clear, I am not trying to promote Anthropic as a somehow ethical corporation that has, that is the leader to follow in this space. Instead, what I'm saying is that there can be an impact when individuals, whether they be staff at a company or voters, stand up and resist the use of AI in a place where they don't believe it. Third is to responsibly use AI. We see many applications, and we write about many in our book, where we think AI can be helpful in public administration, in governance, in civic use cases as well. And we think that AI should be adopted in those cases. In the US, I think a great example of this is language accessibility. We have a very multilingual population in the US, but our government works in many cases exclusively in English. And AI translation tools are not perfect, but I think they've gotten good enough to be very useful in this context. And to me, that makes it unacceptable in cases where our government in the US still does not accommodate people who speak different languages other than English. I think this is an area where we should demand responsible use of AI appropriately implemented by government to overcome those types of barriers. And finally, and I think honestly, most importantly, is renovating democracy to prepare for the impacts of AI. We see so many cases, we write about so many cases in our book, where AI is going to create and exacerbate problems for democracy, but the solutions to that are not necessarily specific to AI. The solutions can be responsive to AI without being specific to it. So in the US context, I think the easiest example of this is in our campaign finance system. We have an enormous amount of corporate money in our politics. There are lots of reforms that advocates have been pushing for decades to make that better. And we haven't adopted, but we know we need to renovate that part of our democracy. And the challenge that I see is that AI, I think, has the potential to supercharge lobbying, to supercharge the influence of dark money in politics. We now see these very wealthy AI corporations investing hundreds of millions of dollars in lobbying the US government. And that is a problem, not because of the technology, but because we have underlying problems in our democracy that need renovation. And AI's fast accelerating impact should urge us to take action. So I will stop there. It is such a delight to be in conversation with you. I'm very much looking forward to my colleagues' comments and response, and then to engaging in dialogue with all of you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nathan. So I'll pass the word to Daniel, please.
Thanks, Naeem. Right. So I've jotted here quite a few things I would like to say and try to say as much as I can in not as much time, given that we don't have much left and leave at least some space for questions. So I think I really enjoyed reading the book. I feel I learned a lot about the possibilities of AI. So let me start by emphasizing some of the things that I think the book does really well. I think the basic frame, this idea that we should think about the speed, scale, scope, and sophistication of AI as a really good basic framework for guiding us through thinking systematically about where, why, and how a use case for AI might appear in different parts of political and administrative life, right? So I think it's useful to think that those are the four big advantages that AI has, and that kind of guides you to where AI might appear in the future in terms of democracy. I really like the way the book develops so many potential use cases. It's really encyclopedic in the way it just covers such a lot of ground in terms of different parts of political life, right? So for those of you who haven't had yet the pleasure of reading it, it's organized around these different functions or activities of politics, right? About campaigning, lobbying, legislating, for the courts, providing justice, and so forth. And on each of this, it says, okay, that's the function, that's what we're doing, and how might AI impact this? So it really covers a lot of ground. And that brings me to I think one of the most valuable points for me was how the book, I mean, actually, after reading the book, I realized more clearly than before, perhaps, that it's not about AI just, suddenly transforming democracy with one killer app, or in one fell swoop, everything will be transformed because AI is here. But rather that it's going to it's already becoming slowly ingrained in many humdrum activities of democracy, the way bureaucrats provide services, the courts dispense justice, the way citizens interact with politics. The cases that Nathan has just showed us, I think, are really fascinating in that respect. So it's more about all these activities, and it doesn't have to be so dramatic in each use case to be cumulatively really important, right? So I think that's a very useful corrective to, both catastrophic views about what AI is going to do to democracy, and perhaps purely optimistic cases about techno-optimism, this is the solution to everything. But rather, democracy goes on, but it becomes slowly transformed through all these use cases. I think for me, what was most valuable in the book. And fourth, I think the authors should be commended for the way they consistently insist that in most areas, AI can be either a force for good or for bad in democracy, depending on how the technology is deployed. So in most use cases that they walk us through in the book, they say, this has its potential, but it could be used for bad as well. So let's beware, right? So I think that balanced, level-headed view is really important. That said, I came away with perhaps less optimistic outlook about the future of democracy with AI than the authors seem to imply. Now I'm a bit more optimistic again after listening to Nathan, so it varies. But I would say that the reason for this is because the authors warn us at the beginning that many past technologies have betrayed their promises. Here I'm quoting, betrayed their promises to the public interest because their value was captured and commandeered by private interests, on a close quote. That's page 13. And it seems likely that this may happen with AI precisely because, I put it, quote again, the potential capture of AI technologies by a few powerful companies will exacerbate its risk to democracy, close quote. So this leads me to some of my comments. And here I want to have the standard caveat. Many times it happens when you write a book that the book then gets criticized, not for what it says, but for what it doesn't say, right? And that isn't always fair because any book has to choose, which battles to fight and what it actually wants to say. So at the risk of falling into exactly that trap, I'm going to say a few things, particularly because I'm a political scientist, so I'm talking from that perspective. And I think that the book might have my overall comment would be that perhaps the book doesn't say as much as it could have about how we make the good win over the bad, right? How do we make those good outcomes happen? Okay. But let me unpack that into just three basic comments. The first is about the definition of democracy that the authors use. Here I quote again, they say that democracy is a system, unquote, for turning individual preferences into group policy decisions and then executing those decisions through society. That's close quote. So they say AI is also an information processing technology, so there's a natural match, right? If democracy is about aggregating preferences and this is an information processing technology, there's a natural overlap. And I agree with that. But the thing is that democracy is more than just a system for aggregating preferences, right? It is about self-government. It's about standing as equals and arguing together about common decisions, right? It's about talking to others. It's learning to care about the common good, about interacting respectfully and forming and changing our preferences as a result of those interactions. Elizabeth Anderson, political philosopher, has conceptualized democracy on 3 levels: as a membership organization, which rests on universal and equal citizenship; second, as a mode of government, where decisions are reached through inclusive discussion among equals; and also as a cultural way of life, in which citizens from all walks of life relate to one another in terms of social equality, mutual respect, and collaborative problem solving. So for Anderson, this 3rd level is really fundamental. It all rests on democracy as a way of life, as this culture of discussion among equals. She doesn't think that democratic government, that's level 2, can be sustained without it. So if we map this back to the book's definition of democracy, which is, of course, an operationalization for the book's purposes, but it mostly maps into the 2nd of these levels as a mode of government, right? And perhaps a fairly thin version of it, because it's about aggregating and executing, but not about discussion among equals per se. So it doesn't say much about the 1st level, about this idea of equal standing and membership, or about the 3rd, as democracy is a culture of relating as equals. And perhaps some of the effects of AI might actually come on those levels. I think to take one example about this idea of having a personal political proxy. I also recently read a paper by Cesar Hidalgo, which I know he's Chilean as well, with colleagues about training your own proxy on Brazilian data and teaching it to teach your preferences, and then it votes for you and and that sort of thing, right? So on one level, I think that might be really cool, but I mean, it's a captivating idea, but it might make democracy reflect our present preferences better. But there's the real danger that it might substitute for actual discussion and thought between us, because we just delegate everything to these political proxies, right? Because when we listen to a presidential debate, when we read opinion columns and we discuss things with others in daily life, we many times discover our own preferences on many topics. They don't come fully formed, right? They are not transparent to us, and they are least transparent to those that are less informed. And the less informed are the most likely to use such a tool and say, okay, you vote for me because I don't really like politics. So if that happens, it could lead to impoverishment of democratic citizenship in a way that the metaphor of democracy is a way of translating preferences into policy just doesn't capture, right? To be fair, the authors do gesture this worry, but I think it deserved a little deeper consideration, perhaps. So I guess the greater danger is that AI might end up depoliticizing society altogether, right? With government increasingly run by AI, citizens handing their democratic responsibilities over to their digital selves. We'd still get policy out, right? But policy that reflects our preferences even better. But much of what it means to be a political community would have been given away on both sides. So that to me is a possibility worth taking seriously, and one that the framing of democracy's preference aggregation makes it hard to see, right? And indeed, a good deal of what the book catalogs as AI uses are about administrative and judicial functions, which go beyond democracy. They could be just as relevant for many of them for non-democratic regimes. I mean, bureaucracy assigning benefits or whatever. You don't have to be particularly democratic, and as long as you have a fairly autonomous judicial system, ruled by off law instead of ruled by law, this still works, right? That's not a critique, but it's broader than just democracy. I had other comments. I had one about polarization. I worry that users might sort into AI brands just as they do now on TV channels. And if I'm right wing, I use Grok. If I am left wing, I use Claude. And maybe then the companies themselves have incentives to pander to those preferences, and that would reproduce the polarization we see on social media and on traditional media by now. And I think those social dynamics might be unexpected consequences as well. But I won't get much into that. And let me close with the political economy of this. I think that's what I guess as a political scientist I missed most, because as Nathan mentioned at the closing, they do have proposals about how to make AI work better for democracy. But the big question for me is, how do we avoid that list of things becoming a wish list and instead becoming some kind of actionable roadmap? I mean, what are the power dynamics? How do we get from here to there, basically? And I think that the big problem that we have is that we already have and are living in a democracy with vast power asymmetries that the AI companies are exacerbating. So that makes getting to that, ideal state all that much harder. The authors do make one big proposal that Nathan mentioned at the end, which is the idea of public AI, which to my non-specialist AI mind sounds great. I really liked it. And I think, especially for democracy-specific uses where issues of bias and fairness are particularly important, for those kinds of things, I think that having some sort of public AI, which doesn't, depend on the data that was fed into it by a private company might make a lot of sense. To be fair as well, in many countries, foreign corporations are more trusted than their own governments, so you never know. But at least where trust in governments is high, that could be a good thing to have, definitely. For Chile, for instance, I think it might be something worth trying out. I have no idea what scale of investment that requires, but I think that's one important proposal. And given the political climate right now, it's fairly bold to say, let's move to public AI. And so I think that's a big contribution on the proposal side. So I leave it there. I might have exceeded myself beyond my own budget. Sorry.
No, that was great. Thanks. Thanks a lot, Daniel. So we usually gather some questions from the audience and then let the author, Nathan, just close it and respond to whatever they want to respond to. So let's go to that. The audience, does anybody have questions?
There's one question on the Q&A.
Okay. Let me look for that Q&A. Okay, I'll just read it. This is from Liam Sohaili. Having the example of Team Mirai and Herald, what do you think is the best first step for applying AI to the Chilean context, knowing how fast AI and democracy are changing and growing? That's a question for Nathan.
I'll be glad to respond, but first I just wanted to thank and appreciate Daniel for what I thought was very, very thoughtful feedback on the book, which I'm grateful for. And I also took notes that I'll share with my co-author, Bruce. I thought the concerns that you raised were spot on and appreciate the feedback throughout, so thank you. I think this is a great question as well. Of course, the first thing I have to say is that I don't have deep familiarity with the Chilean context, so I want to be clear about that. Although I am just coming from this convening I mentioned this morning in Cambridge, which I think might present some interesting ideas to this question. It was a group of folks from across New England, our region here in the United States, that are focused on creating more scalable participation, really getting to Daniel, some of Elizabeth Anderson's ideas about the conceptualization of democracy and the idea that building that culture and way of life and involving people as members, equal members of an organization that comes together traditionally in person to deliberate is really key to how democracy functions. This is a group meeting this morning talking about ways to make that kind of deliberation more scalable across our states here in New England, in part by leveraging technology. And so we had representatives from New Hampshire and from Massachusetts and from Maine talking about innovations that are happening in all three of those places and figuring out how we can work together. And also hearing international examples like the one from Switzerland, where they're using that public AI model Apertus now to convene digital deliberations about the role of AI in Swiss society and the future investment in AI by the Swiss government. So to me, that seems like potentially an interesting first step in response to this question. Is there a way that you can think about how participatory democracy works in Chile today? Are there gaps where that could be strengthened? And to be clear, I do not expect that the answer to all those gaps is technology. I definitely don't expect that. But I think in some cases, there might be a good fit between some gaps and those particular capabilities of AI that we talked about, speed, scale, scope, and sophistication. This morning, we were really focused on the scale piece, the idea that we think in-person facilitated citizens' assemblies and deliberations are really excellent tools for participatory democracy. But even in our relatively small states here in New England, it's difficult to do that with more than perhaps 100 people at a time. Are there ways that we can engage a much broader portion of the public in that kind of deliberation? And so we were talking about tools like the one from CrownShy that I shared that are meant to enable that, as well as others from around the world that we will use in our states here in New England. And I don't know to the extent that to which that may already be happening in Chile. I would love to learn more about that context from you all. But to me, that's what I thought of as the first answer to this question, leveraging AI in civic participation.
Okay, that's great. Anybody else from the audience have questions? I do have my own question actually. I want to give the chance to the audience. Okay. So what I wanted to ask is a very indirect way how, not so indirect, but an indirect way how AI can have a deep impact on politics, and that is the a backlash against AI. So what we see in surveys is that people are tend to be quite anxious about AI. They tend to be suspicious, and the level of suspicion AI suspicion has grown over time. The US is especially, uh, I mean, when you compare the US with European countries, the US people responding to surveys tend to be more suspicious and more anxious about AI than other countries. And AI is becoming a big topic over time. A chart that I saw among like the dominant topics year by year. AI is not, one of the top three topics in these surveys, but this is this is U.S. Data. I don't have the survey in mind right now, but is the topic that is growing the most, and people tend to be suspicious, anxious. That is before a potential mass, I don't know if mass, but big unemployment crisis induced by AI. That may happen or it may not happen. We are not sure, but if if it happens, the backlash will be big, very very big, and that's in a sense it has to do a lot with democracy as well. So I don't know if you have comments on that line of thinking.
I have lots of thoughts on this. I'm happy to weigh in, and Daniel, I hope you will too. First of all, Naeem, the survey data you're describing sounds so familiar to me. I know my own experience oftentimes looking at data within the sciences in the US, the community that I feel identify with. Often AI engineers, AI developers, AI scientists, when they're surveyed, they're generally much more optimistic about the potential impacts of AI. Scientists at large, however, physical scientists, life scientists, social scientists, completely the opposite. Often in survey data, you see that they are very, very anxious. And then in the general public, often it's sort of not even in between, but rather people, their most common response is, I don't know, or I'm not thinking about it. Sort of like you said, Naeem, historically, it hasn't been a top of mind issue, but I think that's starting to change. And I think it should change. I think there should be, and from my perspective, public outcry. I think the backlash that you're describing that we're starting to see is a good thing in the sense that I believe there's an enormous inequity that is being exacerbated by AI today and by those factors that we discussed earlier, the concentration of wealth, the concentration of resources by a few large companies. I think there should be a public backlash to that as people recognize that value and wealth that should be ours, the public's, the people's, is being captured by this handful of companies. I think the question is, how do we harness that backlash in a organized way in a political system to create good, to create a better outcome? This is exactly the challenge, Daniel, that you made in your response. I agree with you. What should the roadmap be? I'll draw on the US context again here, because I think this is really starting to become a debate at the congressional level here, which is good. I don't like all the proposals I'm hearing, but I like the fact that it's being discussed actively. In the last couple of weeks, we've had a proposal from a senator in Vermont, nearby to me, Bernie Sanders, who has proposed a U.S. sovereign wealth fund, the idea of creating a sovereign wealth fund for the U.S. that is funded by a taking of half of the stock value of the largest AI companies. I am glad to hear someone put on the table the idea that wealth being created by these big tech companies should be belonging to the public. I'll give you my point of view, however, that is not the preferred way that I would accomplish that. My concern is that that creates an entanglement of the public interest and the private interest, where suddenly the government and the public benefit becomes dependent on the continued growth dependent on the regulatory accommodation of those companies in a way that I think could have negative outcomes. And we point to examples in the US of our public pension systems that in many cases have had that entanglement realized in a negative way, and to other countries like Norway that have very large sovereign wealth funds that have become entangled with oil companies, fossil fuel companies, in a way that I think causes the government to sometimes act against what would otherwise be the public interest in issues like environment. There are other proposals going around in the US. Our senator here in Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren, has proposed instead the approach of taxing companies on token usage, taxing units of use of AI, and deriving public benefit by providing revenue from the use of the technology itself. And from an incentives point of view, I think that has many benefits. For one thing, it provides a negative incentive to uneconomical use of AI. It internalizes some of what would otherwise be an externality of AI use, which is that there's an energy and environmental cost which is foist on the public, and it causes the companies to have to take more responsibility for that. There's so many other proposals. I completely agree with Daniel that coming up with a comprehensive roadmap of policies and having some coordination internationally is the only path forward. And I'm glad that that backlash is at least causing that debate at the federal level here. Daniel, I'd just love to know how you see this.
No, you're our guest here. But yeah, no, I agree that I hadn't heard that token proposal, and I think that's an interesting way of doing it. But I think that coordination across nations is even harder to achieve than national politics probably in this kind of thing. So I think that what happens in the US in the end matters. The EU, the US, and maybe China are the relevant players here. Most of the rest are just, mostly takers really of what is happening. And the EU it doesn't have big companies of their own, right? So the political economy of the situation suggests that the big game is going to be played in the US mostly, I guess. In terms of what happens there might impact the rest. The EU can influence a little bit from outside, right? Because it has a lot of consumers, wealthy consumers. But yeah, I think that the power dynamic is the politics of the US becomes global as in other issues it has in the past.
Okay, so I think we are about to finish, but since you mentioned him, any relation to Bernie Sanders?
Me, no. We do have the same last name, obviously, but no relation.
Okay, just clearing that up. Okay, so thanks, Nathan, very much. This was wonderful. It was very interesting topics. Thanks a lot to Daniel as well for the comments and for the audience for coming and for the questions as well. So that's it. We'll end for now. Thanks a lot.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Nathan.
Bye. Bye.